Government Communications and Information System and the Department of Social Development are hosting a conversation to challenge the culture of toxic masculinity, hosted under the theme Moving from Toxic Masculinity to Positive Masculinity. The debate seeks to highlight the role that the culture of toxic masculinity has in perpetuating gender-based violence and femicide in the country. Here to talk to us more on this, we're joined by Dr. Matome Kganakga, the Deputy Chairperson of the South African National AIDS Council's Men's Sector. Dr. Matome, good evening, and thank you very much for your time. We look at the latest statistics. 7.1% up is the crime of rape, sexual offences up by 4.7%. When we speak of the rise in crime, particularly contact crime of this nature and gender-based violence in particular, the diagnosis normally says, well, these are because of the socio-structural issues, so social disorganization that leads South Africans to behave like this, and this because of South Africa being a violent country because of the ills and the sins of the past. Is this a helpful description of what the challenge is?
Good evening, Thabo, and the viewers of Newzroom Afrika. Absolutely, it's a part of the challenge. When we talk about violence, we have to look at it comprehensively because there are, three areas of which we have to focus on. The one that you mentioned, of course, it's structural factors that lead to violence. So it's your social, political and economic arrangement within a society. But of course, we also have to look at the systemic, which has to do more with the institutions that either reproduce or sustain that violence, be it cultural, religious, including the of the family and other forms of institution society. And of course, the personal, which is about the norms and values of which we, groom each other as a society.
And where does the toxic masculinity fall within those three that you've mentioned?
It starts with the personal. And ultimately, we have to understand the concept of masculinity, which is, refers to the attributes and behaviors, the social roles and relations of men within a given society, and of course, it's a social construct in the form of gender, differing from your male, which we describe in terms of sex, male and female. So it's those social constructs in which, when you have a rigid description of what it is to mean, it means to be a man, but also reinforcing some of the description around, your hegemonic masculinity, which speaks to, authority, power, predominance. And with those rigid descriptions, once those are under threat or an individual feels that, they're being undermined, it may then express itself in the form of violence.
Yeah. And how do we begin then to entangle this complex thing called toxic masculinity? Just judging from the theme that you've adopted, it says to me that you don't view masculinity in itself as a bad thing, but there's a toxic aspect of it that we need to deal with, and it can turn into a positive thing.
No, absolutely. So it's to appreciate the three aspects I spoke to. Now, the one that we have the most power to respond to as individuals, together with our own social networks, the people that we interact with, it's at that personal level where we need to look at how we normalize these toxic masculinities. And I'll give an example of the pyramid of gender-based violence and femicide. But there's other forms of pyramids, be it of racism or other areas that you could relate to. So at normalization phase, it starts with the problematic language. It starts with those rigid gender stereotypes, the rigid traditional roles that we attribute. And these are conversations that we have with ourselves, including conversations that we have in our own spaces, as boys, whether it's our WhatsApp groups, locker room banter, the safe spaces where we sit. And often we see those as harmless, in terms of problematic language, the rape jokes, the sexist, transphobic, comments, boys will be boys, kind of attitudes that we build. And once we've normalized those, including your rigid gender stereotypes in terms of glass ceiling, to say who sits with power and authority, women belong in the kitchen, and those kind of attributes. While not all of us may graduate from that state, there will be those amongst us who then graduate to higher levels, where you begin to act out and degrade, society, and beginning to harass, beginning to verbally abuse, to stalk, and so forth. And again, this pyramid grows to those who graduate, taking away the autonomy and ultimately, to explicit violence. So we must never look at violence in isolation or toxic masculinity in isolation. It's systematic, starting from the bottom of the pyramid with normalization. So in terms of dismantling it personally, we need to be aware at the level in which we're operating at with this parliament. And this is me and you. Even myself, as I'm speaking here, I always have to check in terms of my language, my attitudes,
right.
In terms of my actions, so that I'm always either calling myself out or my own counterparts.
Yeah, you've eloquently just described precisely how behavior develops and how the change happens over time. Now, where do we begin to plug in the support interventions that will bring about the positive change that we want to see in practical terms? I suppose this dialogue is the beginning of it, but South Africans are at the point where they say we tend to have these dialogues. We dialogue a lot. Our interventions need to be at a more pragmatic level where they plug into society and we begin to see the change.
Well, we must not be, reluctant of dialogue, because the violence starts with dialogue itself. So to reverse that, we need, as I said, the normalization with reversing that problematic language. But of course, we can't deal with it in isolation. We need to be systematic. So we do have programs that, we engage in, be it men's parliaments, boys' assemblies, that we implement. But ultimately, it's about ensuring that we organize as men, working together with boys, so that we deal with this in a systematic manner. Because ultimately, when you talk about violence, it's also systemic. As I spoke about the hegemonic masculinity, in which we reinforce, of the issues around power, authority, predominance, leadership. Because once you entrench it and it's rigid, you then have gender socialization, where you raise boys differently to girls. The whole blue and pink bilateral kind of like raising of children, and ultimately that reproduces itself in power inequality. And once you have power inequality, then you have a social inequality, which then leads to social reproduction of patriarchy. And then you have a patriarchal society, which then has that loop feedback cycle of a hegemonic masculinity. So we need to break the cycle. And to do that, we have to organize ourselves. So when I spoke about men's parliaments as an example, this is where we are calling on men and boys, using these sectoral parliaments as an example, where we begin to organize ourselves and responding directly to your question in terms of how, for instance, as men of South Africa, we're mobilizing ourselves, working with the National Assembly to ensure that, at the summit of this organizing ourselves, we go to the National Assembly and engage as public participants on accountability in terms of the work that we've done over the years and the work that we must do in terms of responding. But also we take it to provinces after our biennial once every 2 years meeting at national, to ensure that we meet annually in provinces. We meet twice a year in districts, all the 52 districts, and quarterly in local municipalities. But importantly, Tabu, is to organize ourselves on the ground through the men's forums, through men's sector, different platforms, including in your own street and your own neighborhood, including through social media, so that we have those men's spaces. As one of our strengths of masculinity is fraternity, brotherhood. It comes natural to us to organize ourselves. So important that we organize in those spaces where we begin to engage with each other around issues of masculinity, particularly positive masculinity.
It's a complex web. I mean, you've touched the personal, the individual, belief, the knowledge, the attitudes. You've touched on the social interaction, the men's parliament, and so forth. The other aspect that we need to talk about is the environmental aspect, the areas in which individuals live, right? The schools, this kind of change happening in the workplace. That's a tough nut to crack, right? For example, inequalities in terms of the pay gap, still a big issue. That change in the boardrooms to begin to happen in the environment in which we live in.
Yeah, I mean, as masculinity, toxic specifically expresses itself through violence, and you talk about structural violence, which is a concept in which the social structures and social institutions, they actually harm people, and they distribute access to social determinants of health inequitably. And South Africa is the most unequal society in the world. We essentially, it explains why we have such high rates of violence. So if we're not dealing with those structural factors, it will be absolutely difficult in terms of the gradient that the individual must walk up, that the higher the steep, the more difficult it is to reach your destination. And we need to deal with all these social determinants of health, be it making sure that, you can see the inequity in our education system, the difference between public and private, including in health. We speak about NHI, universal health coverage. In terms of the economy, we know our triple challenge that we always are engaged on in terms of unemployment, as well as poverty and inequality, but also in terms of neighborhoods, the divide between your urban areas, be it an LX or Sandton dichotomy, or the urban and rural divide. So we need to deal with all those structures, that ensure that there's also social cohesion. And failure to deal with the structural factors, it makes it very difficult for the systemic, including the institutions, as well as the personal, to reach the objective of transforming society.
Dr. Matome, I appreciate your time and all the best with the work that you're doing. That is Dr. Matome Kganakga there. Of course, they have been in that dialogue in dismantling toxic masculinity.